Well, I'm very honored to be on this panel with my esteemed and respected colleagues. And seems to be my lot to go first all the time because Emerge was the first program, but also alphabetically, I'm always going first too, so, it's just something I'm used to. So I'm going to talk about Emerge. We were asked to give a little background, but also anything that we think is unique. I guess I'd start with just saying something that we would be characterized as a psychoeducational model. And what I mean by that is that we certainly have lots of education. And the first part of our program, the first 8 weeks is strictly educational. There are 8 lessons. And then after that, we move into the second stage of the program, which really has elements of counseling to the extent that we're giving individualized feedback to group members and actually doing problem solving with them and making use of the group, engaging the whole group in a process of doing problem solving. But I always like to say that we definitely are not psychologically reductionistic. We don't see this as being a problem that is only about individual psychology by a long shot. I think that our approach would be based on what we'd call an ecological model. And what I mean by that is that the individual is influenced by a whole bunch of things, basically. Certainly society in terms of gender inequality, as well as other forms of oppression, culture in terms of gender norms, religion, neighborhood, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, all of those things influence, and also family. Also family influences individual behavior and choices, as well as personality. And when I say that, I think about my brother. So I grew up in a horribly abusive home. My father was abusive to my mother and us 4 children, and ultimately it led to the death of my mother. But I never became an abuser, and yet my brother did, my younger brother. And so we had the same parents, basically. And so what accounts for that? I mean, how do you explain that, basically? And that's where I think that the feminist model, I think, probably does the best job of explaining why so many men batter women. But it never tells you enough about why an individual batters. And why all men don't batter, for that matter. And so I think you do need to look at personality. When I think about my brother, I think about ways that I think he was just especially susceptible to copying my father's behavior. I think he's kind of a black or white thinker. He's pretty rigid, I think, in his thought process. I think he's pretty angry. I think of him as being very insecure. And I guess the main thing I think about him is that he feels sorry for himself a lot, and he's got this sort of aggrieved, mentality, and out of that, I think somehow leads him to be abusive, that he somehow seems to see himself as a victim, and then lashes out, basically because of that. And I think to some extent, I think that could be true of a lot of abusers. And so on to what's unique about Emerge. One thing that's unique is that we have a high percentage of voluntary clients. And so the breakdown of our clients is 35% voluntary, 45% court referred, and 25% child welfare. And really, when I say voluntary, I primarily mean partner mandated, and so those are primarily people whose partners have told them, that they want them to attend our program. Maybe they've read a book, they've been attending a support program. And I think that, but that's something that it's not accidental. I think it reflects, I think, the deep commitment we have to community partnerships. And so we have very fantastic relationships with domestic violence programs, with victim advocates. We often are asked to come and speak to their support groups. We have a lot of really good relationships with faith leaders. And we have a lot of good relationships with substance abuse programs. So one of the sources of referral is substance abuse program, who have tons of abusers, who don't necessarily self-identify as being abusive. And so that results, I think, in a kind of a unique constellation, because I think nationally it's only probably about 5% of abusers are voluntary. And so it also, I think, reflects the high degree of engagement that we're able to achieve in our program. We have actually 25% of our clients at this point that decide to extend themselves in the program, that they extend themselves beyond the 40 weeks, which is the minimum for our program. And there's a lot of people that really talk that up with each other too, that say, I don't think you're really ready. I think you should continue, and so there's a lot of really good engagement around that by the group members. And so let me see what else. So accountability, and I think that I think a lot of my fellow panelists, I would venture to say all of us would kind of agree with this, that we are that part of our outcome is not just how many clients do we graduate, but also what else do we do, basically, that documents accountability or lack of accountability, and so for us, we write very meaningful reports to the courts, and we make copies of those available to the partners if the partners are interested in having copies. And so like 13 weeks into the program, if a person is still blaming his partner, then that is something that we put in our report, or is still minimizing their abusive behavior. That is very meaningful information because that predicts recidivism. We also flag dangerousness and risk. That also is extremely useful to courts as well as to victims too. And so that's a part of really what we take pride in is really kind of the carefulness, the accountability to the wider community, not just the people that are sitting in the groups with us. And I'm sure we all kind of probably agree with that, and anyway, the partner contact, I think in Massachusetts, is unique in terms of the extent of partner contact that we do. It is very much about, we have a full-time partner contact coordinator who's responsible for coordinating the outreach that we do with the partners, and partners really love having contact with us. We give them good information. We get really good information from them. And so that very much informs, we don't repeat the information, obviously, but that very much informs what we do in terms of the directions that we take and the kinds of feedback that we give to our group members. How am I doing with time, David? I didn't keep time.
You have about 3.5 minutes left.
3.5 minutes. Okay. I figured I'd just talk about one exercise that we do just for kicks. It's called Survivor Skills. And it's really designed for men and women who grow up in violent homes or violent neighborhoods. And it's a very simple exercise. It really starts with kind of a brainstorm of what are different survival skills a person might have developed if they grew up in a violent home or neighborhood. And the brainstorm lists things like being so fierce that people won't mess with you, being very defensive, being distrusting of other people, drinking, drugging, exaggerating your accomplishments. And then we move on to saying, okay, so how do those things play out in your relationship? Because all of those things are toxic to a relationship. And so really we're kind of introducing the notion that sometimes we need to grow our survival strategies. We need to sort of, the very thing that might have helped us to survive is now our worst enemy, so to speak, is really preventing us from having good relationships. And so it's a really good exercise because I think it's kind of a strength-based approach because we're sort of taking something, a strength that they have, and then redirecting them so they can put it to a better purpose. So I think it's something that that we found to be very effective too. So I think that is all that I want to say at this point. If I have any more time, questions and comments are fine. Thank you.
Okay, if there are any questions, we have 2 minutes before we can go into Scott's time, or we can just go into Scott's time. If you have questions, can you put it in the chat or raise your Zoom hand and I'll call on you. Going, gone. Scott?
I yield my time to the gentleman from Minnesota.
Scott, we lost your audio.
I was just going to say the exact same thing, David, except my mic was off, so I couldn't, and I forgot that I did that. Okay, so yeah, so in solidarity with Lisa, who wanted to use a PowerPoint, and maybe she ended up not doing one, I put one together. So and I did it just before this. So every slide's going to be a surprise because I don't even remember the order. So we'll see. All right, Jeff, you want to pull it up? No, that's for this one. So Jeff, who runs the show here, was thinking it was for the other presentation I'm doing. Well, okay, so I started working in Duluth 22 years ago. Ellen Pence was my mentor, a colleague of David's and Jeffrey's, and so really the hardest part of the work for me was just undoing the process that we use. This Freudian idea of dialogue was to learn that and take it on. It was when you grow up in a world that, as Freire would say, banks your education. In other words, imposes information on you and expects you to give it back the way it was given. His notion, that's domesticating. That isn't liberating kinds of education, and that's was the hardest thing for me in a men's group to really learn, and it is for the people that we work with and train. It's one of the hardest things to overcome. So, Jeff, I can see the slide, but I can't. Can they see it? No, they can't see it. We're working on it here. Well, I'll tell you what, Jeff.
It's okay. I've got a PowerPoint, so Lisa will be cool with me.
Yeah, yeah. Jeff, can you play so you can't share your screen?
I'm addicted.
Right now, right?
I'm addicted to PowerPoint.
You can? Okay. Can you share the screen and get the PowerPoint up?
There you go.
Things are exciting. Well, we didn't want you to see too much of it, so we put it out there and took it back. Can you? Yeah, you can see it now. I take it.
Yeah, we can see all of your slides on the side, so you're not in a slideshow mode yet.
Yeah, we'll get that fixed. There we are. Yeah. Huh. Well, there it is.
Click it again. Click it again, Jeff.
Huh. Well, okay. So why don't we go to the video? Because I just added video on top of this. We'll just see, since I'm so deep in technological problems, I might as well dive even deeper here. So Jeff, can you play the video? You can? Great. Why don't you go ahead and do that and we'll go from there. Yes.
in its simplest explanation, is that we sat down with over 200 women who were being battered and said, if we get these guys in this group for 15, 20, 25 weeks, what do you want us to do with them that would make your life better? And then women started talking about what they were being subjected to. A lot of economic control, a lot of isolation. They started talking about the way that he uses the kids against them. They just started talking about the barrage of things that are happening to them. And what women said is that we want him to see that it's not just hitting us that's battering, it's standing over us and pointing the finger and calling us names and telling us what the kids can and can't do, and doing this kind of pattern of ways of controlling her through coercion, intimidation, violence, but also through money, through status, all this. So we ended up talking with that all through with them and came up with that power and control wheel, in which the women were saying, he gets power and he gets control. Now, they didn't say he desires it. They said he gets this by using all these tactics. And somewhere in that discussion with women, this tactics word came out. So we designed this graphic. It's basically a thing that says you get power and you get control by using these coercive tactics. And so basically the women said to us, we want them to see that that's what they're doing. And we want them to give it up for something that would lead to a more loving relationship.
Okay. So I think one of the things that makes our curriculum unique is that the framework of the curriculum is based on what women said they wanted us to talk to the men about. And then what they wanted, where they wanted him to go. And what's interesting over the years is that power and control wheel, as we've worked with communities around the world and different cultures around the world who've worked at adapting it, we've come to learn that what the women were saying were the tactics are actually the tactics of oppression. That when people are oppressed in the world, these are the tactics that are used. Men who batter didn't invent them. They learned them from the culture that surrounds them. And so, for example, in the indigenous communities that we've worked with from the Pacific to Canada and in between, they've talked about how they're not looking to adapt the power and control wheel, because to them, the power and control wheel is colonization. That's the value system of colonizers. And so that's what they're trying to undo in their community. So they want the wheel to look like that. But then the equality wheel looks like something very different that actually reflects the values of the indigenous community that is using it. So, when you have all of these partnerships from around the world with people working with the material and adapting it and creating different content to work with the population or their community, you realize that the scope of what Ellen and her colleagues and all the women that participated were doing back when this was developed. And so, so in order to execute the curriculum, there has to be a deep understanding of her experience living with somebody who is executing these tactics against them. And once that is learned, then there's a way to start engaging. And so I mentioned earlier this notion about banking education and Freudian dialogue. And so I want to play one more quick little video to kind of explain that in a really efficient way here. Jeff, do you want to run that, please?
Just say a little bit about how Paulo Freire infused the curriculum and what the expectations are of a facilitator that's using the Duluth curriculum.
Well, Freire's educational model is that you don't do what he calls banking education. You don't give a lot of information to someone and then give them a test to see what % they can give back. You're putting stuff in their head and you should be able to withdraw it. That's what he calls banking education. He says the way people learn is by exploring their life. You put their life out in front of them, and then you have discussions with different people about what is going on there. And it's through that reflection on your daily life, and then getting some information, in fact, taking a value like nonviolence or balance or equality or love. And Freire uses a lot about love. You would say, okay, is this a loving scene, what we just saw? What if we said that this had to have love in it? What would it look like? And so then you start to pose the questions, can there be love and violence? Can there be this and this? I mean, for me, you're having discussions with men that they're going to get nowhere else in their life. And that's why I think it cheapens it to say, oh, it's ideological, it's gender-based, it's saying men are good and women are bad. It's just not what's happening in those groups. I mean, to me, they're very intimate experiences of somebody for the first time in some of these guys' lives saying, you can talk about your life in a way that it's really men talking for the first time about what does love mean? What do we want with our kids? What was that like? And then putting that all up against, look what we're doing. Is this going to get us where we want to go?
David, where are we at time-wise? I forgot to keep a clock myself.
So did David.
You have 5 minutes.
He made that up. Okay. All right. So Jeff, can you get the slide working or not? Sort of. Okay. We'll do it. We'll give it a sort of try here. Okay. We'll just have the, yes, you can see it. Yep. All right. So next slide, Jeff. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're one of the 2 longest running national models for working with men are better, Emerge is the other. The content is based on women's experience of being better at the hands of their male intimate partner. And the process is adapted from Paulo Freire's method of dialogue. So those are the things that we just kind of talked about is foundational to the curriculum. And then the other piece too is that we locate our men's program linked to all of the other responses that we've developed in Duluth. So whether it be the shelter response, the visitation center, the criminal justice system, the human service system, all of those have particular policies and protocols that were developed through a set of principles that all interventions in the community adhere to, including the men's nonviolence program. So our thinking around that is that the more we can link everybody's activity together when it comes to either managing her safety or managing his rehab, that the better we're going to be able to do. It's harder for him to slip through the cracks when there's not many cracks that exist. So that's the idea of bringing the entire community in on what we're doing in a formal way. Next slide, Jeff. Next slide, Joe. All right. So one of the things,
Scott, the slides that Jeff's sharing, we're still on the first slide, so we're not seeing what you want.
Oh, you're not seeing them. Okay. I will just use them as talking points then, rather than trying to fix this, since we just got minutes left. And so I guess you can just look at the first slide. Sorry. So one of the things that's evolved in the curriculum is that we've been looking at a lot of programs and how they take what we teach them and execute it. And one of the things that I think that we've learned is that the way that we educate on this through training, given the complexity of how to do the work, might be a platform that has to shift. So, for example, we've been working for the past almost 4 years now on how to move what we do teaching this curriculum to a self-guided online program. And the difference in my delivery versus the delivery of that is that it can take people so much deeper into understanding the intersectionality of oppression and how all these things connect together in a men's group room, time that you just don't have in the 3-day kind of training format that we've been using for many years. So we haven't pulled it off yet. We're, like I said, we've been doing this for 4 years and it's way more complex than we thought it was going to be. But this is something that we're trying to evolve toward. And then developing partnerships with programs that are doing adaptations. Next year, we're going to, through Global Rights for Women, going to have a series where people who have done adaptations, we just had one come out of the Amish community, where they're a power and control wheel to show how those tactics get used in that particular community. A Pacific Islander, as I mentioned earlier, women in politics, Brandon Elkire, who's doing work in the Twin Cities on adapting the wheel and showing how the US government has passed current federal Indian law that that fits into all the tactics on our power and control wheel to control Indigenous people in the country. So all the ways in just expanding on people's depth of understanding of oppression and how it plays into the work that we do. And the better we understand it, the better we'll be able to deliver it when it comes before us in a men's group room. So I think I'm close. If I'm not.
Perfect spot to end there, Scott. Thank you.
All right.
Jeffrie,
So
we're going to
I
turn
wish good luck to Lisa and Jeffrie for their technology. I hope it's better than mine.
Okay, well, we'll see how I do. I was so confused because you kept saying Jeff, and I'm like, I'm not moving the slides.
different Jeff.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and let's see. Can we see my screen now?
Yes. Go into
And now you're going
presentation
to,
mode.
yep. And here we go. And I will actually write down the time.
You're going until 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I am actually quite honored to be amongst this august group. I'm Jeffrie Cape, and I'm here to talk to you about the HEAL program and specifically the concept of conceptual clarity. So conceptual clarity is the process of connecting theory and practice. And this process of using conceptual clarity is extremely adaptable. It is not just for BIP programs. It is not just for a particular curriculum. So similar to what you heard Scott talking about earlier about how the power and control wheel is about the concept of oppression, conceptual clarity is the process of how you put together the idea that you're working on and are able to adapt it to fit into different places. So we start with names. Names matter. Names matter for programs, names matter for people, names matter for organizations and for cities and for communities. And so when I was creating my agency, which is Churn Services, I went to Greek mythology. And in Greek mythology, Churn was the guide on the river Styx. And depending on how people lived their life, he dropped them off in either Hades or paradise. Their actions determined what they did. All he did was guide them to where they were already going. And I really liked that metaphor because all of my years of clinical work and things like that, that's all I do. I can't make anybody change. I would if I could, but I can't. And I'm a guide. And whether they end up in Hades or paradise is about the choices that they make. And so it's a metaphor for the work. Now, I did a little switch. Some people may notice that the name Jeff is not usually associated with women. And my parents chose to spell my name differently. So Charon is actually spelled with one R in all of the mythology books. I put 2 R's in it just to make it different and to sort of be a little twist for myself. And when I came to creating the program and naming HEAL, it was intentional that the acronym spelled out HEAL, because it's about the idea of individuals healing, families healing, people healing, communities healing. And HEAL stands for helping explore accountable lifestyles. So there's that accountability word that you heard from David and from Scott, and you'll probably hear from Lisa too. So this is a journey-informed program. Yesterday, you got to hear from David Mandel, and David and I have sometimes joked about how we ended up on opposite sides. We took different journeys. David started out in the DV side of the world and ended up working with child welfare. I started out in child welfare and ended up working in DV. And so my work was informed by my first and primarily about children being safe and growing up in homes where they could thrive. And then I became an EAP, and my work there was in working with workplace violence, which turns out to be mostly domestic violence spillover. And then I went to a mental health agency, and that was the first place I created my first program. That was actually when David Garvin and I became associated with each other, and that was the SAVE program, which also, you know, had an acronym, which was Stop Aggressive and Violent Encounters. And then I went to Catholic Social Services in Washtenaw County, where the ADA program, Alternatives to Domestic Aggression, was, which is where David was the leader for so many years. And then finally, the creation of the HEAL program. So all of those experiences informed the creation of the program that we have now. Now, I have to make a confession here. When I first heard about trauma-informed treatment, I didn't know what people were talking about, because all of my experience came through the trauma field, and I didn't know there was any other way to do the work. So when I started going to trauma-informed trainings, I was like, well, this is just regular work. And so our roots came from trauma, and it's an integral underlying piece of what goes into the program. And you heard David Adams talking about the fact that you have to look at people holistically. You're going to hear Lisa Nitsch talk about that also. You heard Scott talking about the different areas of the community. And so our goal in trauma, and I truly wish I had more time, I will probably talk about this in the group this afternoon. This morning, we had a group, and every single man in the room, every one of them, went below the surface into sharing some of the things that have influenced them and some of the trauma experiences they've had. But our focus is not on it causes this, but how is this getting in my way? How is this showing up in my life? And part of the way in which we train all of our facilitators is to help them to understand the boundaries for addressing it within the structure of the program. In conceptual clarity, every single thing must have a purpose. And it all starts from the principles, moves up into the way in which you designed the program and the policies that you put into place. And that influences the exercises, the facilitation, and then the application. The advantage of using this kind of framework, which is really what conceptual clarity is it's a framework, is that it gives you the ability to adapt and to grow. Right now, we are in the process with Ben in our program to help us become a little more culturally and a lot more generationally sensitive, because we have a lot of young men, and I'm an old woman and I need to know more about what's going on in there. So conceptual clarity allows us to be able to add things and take things out when they don't work anymore. Now, underlying principles that guide our clarity: presumption of competence. We presume that people can change. And what we know is that every single person's story, when you get into it, it makes sense how they got there. It doesn't mean it was the only option. It doesn't mean it was the best option. It doesn't mean it was an inevitable option, but it means that it's an understandable option, understandable being different than acceptable. And the other piece of presumption of competence, and it goes into the way the program runs, it goes into the way in which the exercises are designed, is that it allows us to identify and build on people's strengths, which again, you've already heard some people talking about that today. But being clear about what that is and how you're doing that. A second underlying principle: this is a learned behavior and it's a decision that people make. And that's good news and bad news, because when it's learned, it means that you can learn something else. And when it's a decision you make, it means you can make another decision. The bad news is you learned whatever you learned, and this was the decision you thought was a good idea at the time. Open groups. Open groups allows us to have instant access. It allows us flexibility, not just for us, but for the people in the program, so that they can be successful and still have a life. It provides people with reinforcement for concepts that they think that they understood, but now they're working and helping other people or hearing other people sound like they did. And it gives men who are starting hope, because they get a preview into where they might possibly evolve. It's a self-paced program. And again, this afternoon, I'll be talking very detailed about the stages of change. But what self-paced does is it means nobody misses any concepts. It doesn't matter what is going on, because it's not based on the lesson. When the person comes into the group, they're at the beginning. And they walk into a group with somebody who may be somewhere in, the challenge section or in Sankofa, but no concepts get missed when you have a self-paced program. And again, each of us can think of things where we have strengths. Okay, like if you put me in a classroom with people who are doing math, I will not be able to keep up. I cannot see numbers in my head. I know that there are people who do. I cannot. But you put me in a class where we're doing words and language stuff, and I'm going to be bored out of my mind if I have to go along with the person who's, following back. We don't all learn things at the same pace, and the same thing happens in the program. There are some people who have a lot of trouble at the beginning and then really get it, and they catch fire and they're able to move ahead. And there are some people who start in the beginning gangbusters, and then they start getting into deeper things and it becomes harder for them to move forward. And so again, here's this little stages of change. You can see each of our components go in there. And look at that, I even left 2 minutes for questions.
Well, technically you got about 55 seconds.
Okay, well, according to my watch.
I'm wired into Greenwich. Does anybody have any questions? Karen had a question that I answered already, unless you want to add to it, Jeff, about open admission.
I'm sorry, I can't see the question because
I just said it was it's rolling admission. Question from Sarah Huser is
Sankofa.
What is Sankofa?
Thank you. And we'll talk more about this afternoon, but Sankofa is a mythical bird from Ghana that can only move forward by looking backward. And it means go back and retrieve. And in Sankofa, which is the last section of the formal portion of being in the program. There are 16 assignments. Each and every one of them is designed. In fact, we had a man this morning, and he was explaining to the other men, he goes, when you look at the Sankofa section, it looks like a bunch of sheets for fourth graders. And he said, when you get in and do the work, you have to think really hard, because they're all designed, and we came up with this. We give kudos to Rich Tolman, who many of you may know because he helped to guide us and find this. But it is a key principle that goes along with our presumption of competence and the idea that we don't want people to ever think that they are finished with this process.
Thank you, Jeffrie. We're going to stop you right there. And Lisa, the bases are loaded.
Yes, sir.
Casey's at bat.
Yeah, so I'm here to talk about House of Ruth Maryland's intervention program, which we brand as the Gateway Project. House of Ruth Maryland has been around since 1977, and because of our strong brand in the Baltimore City area, we knew that our participants would like to have another name to say they're going to a program, and so we thought the Gateway Project was a name that reflected well what we were working on. I inherited a program in 2002 that was called the Batterers Program, so we've been through a pretty significant redesign. And learned a lot from some of the folks here on this panel, as well as other providers. But we are part of a comprehensive victim service agency, and we launched our program development in 2002. And I really scoured the field for curriculum that fit our population and fit our needs. And we couldn't find one specific. We found really strong pieces and elements of other curricula that we loved. But for the nuts and bolts of our program, it's a 28-week, 2-stage model program, 90-minute sessions every week, open enrollment that allows for that in-group mentoring. So folks are coming in all the time, but we're located in Baltimore City, Maryland. And when we were looking at curricula, what really spoke to us, obviously, what emerged really led the way around the intention and the utility of abuse. And we agree with their educational and advocacy model that anybody really should be able to come into this work and come into the field and engage with it. And so we certainly appreciated that. We were misusing, I want to be clear, none of the staff at the time, when I joined in the team in 1998, had been trained to use the Duluth model, but I inherited a counterfeit version of that model. And so I know that one a little bit more familiar, and there's a lot that we loved about that. Certainly the power and control framework, that feminist oppression, this being an issue of oppression was really important to us. But also the idea of community engagement and program design was something that we learned from them, and the need to speak to your community to figure out what they wanted and needed. And also the idea of process versus teaching. I always say some of the worst facilitators I've ever hired were teachers because they want to talk to our participants like children, and adult learning is so much different from that. We also really appreciated the systems model introduced by Gus Kaufman at Men Stopping Violence, that this idea that socialization is not just at the individual level, but also in the family, the community, broader social systems, and even on a global level when we talk about patriarchy and colonialism. But I do want to share, I am addicted to PowerPoint, but mostly because I talk really fast, and I find that it's helpful for folks to understand what I said when you can also see the image of it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen quickly for you, and I'll move out of presentation mode in just a second. But what I want to share with you is really kind of who we're serving. When we talk about the individuals, and I'm going to use 2019 data because we're all going to pretend 2020 and 2021 didn't happen. And when we talk about who was in our program, we were dealing with a population that is 58% unemployed versus a 6% unemployment rate for Baltimore City as a whole. 57% of our participants had no high school diploma or GED, compared to 16% across the city. 75% were single, 8% married. 84% self-identified as Black or African American, and 9% self-identified as white or Caucasian, as compared to a 63 and 30% split, which tells us we were not seeing the battering population of Baltimore City, and there was something involved in the systems. Given that 90% of our participants are court mandated, there's something in terms of our referral process that we were overrepresented with low-income men of color in Baltimore City. 85% of our participants are fathers, and in a few years ago, we started collecting data using the PCL5 to indicate rates of PTSD, and found that more than 40% of our population qualifies or at least hits a threshold and a screening tool for PTSD. And that's important because when we're looking at not just the individuals we serve, but the community that we're serving, we have a tremendously high murder rate that continues to go up. Our community violence is, obviously the stuff that news are made of and HBO series are made of. People always ask me if The Wire or if we own the city or is actually what the city is like. And I always say yes, but our police are not quite that clever. But that is the kind of violence that we're dealing with and the level of corruption that we've seen. We also have just a total lack of a coordinated community response. The system that did exist was defunded a few years ago. And because of the elevated violence in our community, we've just got this hostile relationship between systems. The judges are pointing at the state's attorney, who's pointing at the mayor, who's pointing at our police department. Our Baltimore City Police Department is under a consent decree since 2017 because of well-documented constitutional violations against Black families and communities. And so I'd love to have a healthy, coordinated community response, but that's just not who we're working with them. So thinking about who we serve, we did some values work and thought about kind of what do we believe. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but it was the foundation of our building, that we believe abusive partners are capable of escalating their violence and some to lethal levels. They're capable of changing and becoming non-abusive. They're likely to have been witnesses of trauma or oppressive systems. We believe abusive partners abuse because there's a lack of individual and social consequences. And I'll go more into this later in my workshop, that it's what they've witnessed, what they've learned, and what has been reinforced. And they're operating from insecure fear, and that power feels good and healthier alternatives can feel unfamiliar. But we also believe that people change when they have the knowledge, the tools, and healthy role models, and when the benefit outweighs the costs, and when they can communicate an environment where they feel safe and not shamed, which is really important for us. So the elements that we've added on top of what we've borrowed from our predecessors, we incorporated all what the concepts Audre Lorde was bringing in around multiple issue lives, and Kimberly Crenshaw, the idea of intersectionality, that we kind of layered on top of the feminist oppression framework. Not just that we acknowledge that our participants may have engaged and that our participants both perpetrate and experience multiple oppressions in their lives, but we bring it intentionally into the room to use it as a teaching tool. We use the phrase when we're writing curriculum, how can you cry racism while you're standing on your sister's neck, right? Tapping into their feelings of powerlessness, feelings of resentment, and thinking about how they may be creating that same atmosphere with their partner and their children. We also talk about the impact of chronic stress and traumas, not just on the individual, but also on the family system. And we need to be talking about it at the community level. What does it mean to be living within a chronically stressed and traumatized community? The other thing that was what we think was really innovative and what we've not seen anywhere else is having a low literacy curriculum. We had to be writing at a 5th grade reading level in order to engage our full group. But also when you're working with a low literacy population, that means avoiding writing tasks, including written homework assignments, recognizing that every single thing we put in their hands, everything we teach, they're going to take very, very literally. And we really limited our case study examples because according to the literature, people with lower reading levels have a hard time projecting, watching a case study and then projecting that onto their own experience and connecting to it. We got participant input on every single one of the 28 group sessions that we've created, and did multi-year consultation and peer review with some of my professional mentors, Dr. Oliver Williams out of the University of Minnesota, who's also run the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American community, as well as our dear friend Fernando Medeiros, who does a lot of great fatherhood work and domestic violence work in the Boston area. And with that, I got fancy too, Scott, and I've got a quick video because I want folks to know we caught a lot of heat when we were making some of this transition, that we were sort of quote unquote dumbing it down for folks, that we were colluding or we were somehow hand-holding, making it easier to get through. But I just want to show you a video. This is our Ages and Stages exercise where we talk about the impact of intimate partner violence on children at every age. And I just want to show just a couple minutes of the real work that these folks are doing. They had just broke out into groups that were each assigned an age group, either infants and toddlers, school age, or teenagers, and they had to brainstorm based on the developmental milestones that the children were going through at that age. What's the impact, the negative impact that domestic violence would have on them? So here's just a few minutes of that. Well, first, let me make sure I am sharing my screen in a way that will let me do video. Just a second. Yeah, almost did not have the sound there. Here we go.
Started. So we had infants and toddlers in group 1. So what are some ways that infants and toddlers may be affected by domestic violence?
Like growing up, like as far as infants, like fresh babies.
Fresh babies.
Yeah, we usually sound like with arguments and stuff, the negative energy. I always was told, like, don't argue, because me and my baby mom had our first child, we used to have like little arguments and stuff, but we was told off the rip, like, y'all don't want to be arguing on the baby, because like negative vibrations and stuff. It's just something about it, like that
It
goes
shatters
off.
them. It shatters them, for real.
And
It does.
they can sense, I feel like they can sense that type of stuff.
Okay.
They can't do too much but cry and whine as far as infants, because that's all they can do. So I'm like,
But they hear it and they visual see it.
yeah, so I'm thinking that'll like mess up their like sleep patterns or something like that.
How they accept things.
What do you mean by that?
Accepting falls like people. Like say they not is like looking for somebody to hold them. You know, because it's
Started. So we had.
I mean, I basically just think they're gonna mimic everything they see.
Okay. So what are they gonna do?
They hear cussing words, a couple days later they're gonna be walking around saying, yeah, cuss words. As far as fighting, I think that
what's the age of a toddler? I'm sorry.
I'm thinking like 3 to 5.
Usually it's like 2 to 5.
Yeah. So that's right. And they gonna mimic. They gonna look at it like they gonna mimic us, man.
Ronnie's bad as hell, yo.
Yeah.
You trying to swing on me.
My son 5.
No, I know people, kids that my son. Let me stop.
Mark Anthony Jr. 5. He bad.
Yeah, and some parents
To make it behavioral issues.
yeah, some parents allow that too. Like
Especially if it's used to like people arguing.
Yeah,
I mean,
you know.
especially if somebody used to zapping out, they zap out. You know.
So I wanted to share that with you just so that you kind of see we meet our clients where we are. We're using the language that they use, engaging with them, but not, bringing the concept, still introducing the same concepts of power and control that a traditional intervention program would be using. We were very fortunate. We were able to have our program evaluated by the Maryland Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention. Dr. Tara Richards and Dr. Chris Murphy did first a fidelity study to make sure that we were providing the service that we claimed to provide. And then we did an evaluation study, and we were able to demonstrate that people who successfully complete the Gateway Project are not only less likely to commit a domestically related crime, but 40% less likely to be criminally involved in any system at all. And so that's then recently was published in December 2021 version of the APA's Psychology of Violence Journal. We have seen a tremendous increase in our attendance based on our redesign, the engagement of our community, sort of recognizing the realities that they live in. But I want to be really, really clear in that the foundation of this really was about the community work that we did. We did community listening sessions that were guided by what's now Esperanza United. We got feedback at every turn. We had a lot of peer consultation, and particularly people who have expertise around the role of intimate partner violence in Black communities. And so I always say, I'm not here I don't expect that what we are doing would work in all communities. It worked for our community, and we built it for our community. If you feel like your demographics and your community can relate to ours, I think it's something worth exploring, but also, checking whether or not your values align with ours. I think that's the most important thing. Too often I see kind of programs get started and they inherit a curriculum and build a program around that versus really thinking about what does your community need. We were lucky to have people who encouraged us to be creative and to try new things. And so we publish the curriculum just because we see a need and people have asked for it, but we really built it for ourselves. So, I don't know, and I don't expect that it can be generalized across the country or even on a global level the way Scott's can and Dave's can. It is very, very specific to disinvested communities and low literacy populations, but I'm happy to share more about it later. Thank you.